Have you ever walked through a patch of those sepia nimeralis snails?
Those colorful land snails?
Yeah, like the ones with all the crazy shell patterns.
Yeah.
I mean, you look down and you've got pink, brown, yellow, and then every kind of stripe you can imagine.
It's amazing, the variation.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you stop and wonder, what's going on here? What's driving all that variation? Yeah. You know, you might immediately think, well, obviously it's natural selection, right? Different environments, different camouflage.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems super intuitive. But what if there's another piece to the puzzle? Something maybe not so obvious.
Yeah, something a bit more random, maybe.
Exactly,
But,
yeah. Bit more accidental.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue into what we're exploring today.
Oh, cool.
The whole idea of genetic drift.
Okay.
Think of it as this kind of evolutionary nudge, almost like a gentle push in a particular direction caused by chance occurrences. And it becomes especially noticeable in smaller populations.
Yeah.
It kind of gives us this alternative or maybe even a complementary way to understand why we see the range of biological traits that we do.
So not just the classic survival of the fittest story.
Exactly.
It's like rolling the dice a little bit, too.
A little bit of luck involved.
Now, I know for our listener, you coming at this from a philosopher's perspective,
Yeah.
you're probably already thinking about, the deeper implications here.
Absolutely.
And you'll be interested to know that genetic drift, it's not exactly a settled issue.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Even its core definition, what it actually is, sparks all these debates.
Huge debates.
Yeah, among biologists and philosophers of biology alike.
Exactly. It gets right to the heart of things.
Yeah, it really does. It digs into those really fundamental questions about the role of chance in shaping life as we know it.
You said it.
So where do we even begin with this? How do we even start to untangle this concept of genetic drift?
Well, maybe a good starting point is to trace back the origins of this idea. Where did these initial inklings even come from?
Where did this all start?
Right. So to unpack this whole thing,
Okay.
maybe we should go all the way back to Darwin.
Oh, wow. Okay, to the source.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to look back at what he actually said.
Yeah.
Because even in The Origin of Species, he briefly mentions these variations neither useful nor injurious.
Interesting.
Right? These are those traits that natural selection wouldn't really act upon either way.
Huh.
So he kind of just throws out this idea that these might just fluctuate randomly in a population or eventually even become fixed as the only trait.
Just by chance.
Yeah. It's really quite striking how close this is to our modern understanding of drift.
It's like he had this little seed of the idea.
Yeah, he plants the seed.
But he doesn't really water it and let it grow.
He doesn't fully develop it.
Yeah, it's more of a passing observation.
Yeah, and what's even more intriguing is that the first steps towards a more concrete theory of drift actually emerged from studying the kinds of variations Darwin had pointed out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, picture this. We're in the late 19th century.
Okay.
This guy, John Gulick, is meticulously studying different forms of snails.
Snails again.
Yeah, always back to the snails.
They're a good model organism.
They are, and he's looking at them in Hawaii in these seemingly identical environments.
Okay.
And he's seeing all this variation.
Mm-hmm.
So his big breakthrough was this idea that small, isolated populations, they can actually drift apart genetically over time, even without any obvious differences in the environment or selective pressures.
Just kind of on their own.
In a way, yeah. So he kind of proposes this scenario where a tiny group of snails migrates to a new area, right? And they become isolated from the original population.
Or cut off.
They're on their own.
Okay.
And maybe they encounter some slightly different local conditions.
Oh.
And now any new neutral variation they happen to carry just by chance, it can become more common as that new isolated population grows.
Because there's no mixing with the original population.
Yeah, exactly.
They're on their own little evolutionary trajectory.
Right. And this idea of geographic separation leading to these isolated pockets of variation, it's like a really early precursor to how we understand drift today.
It's like the stage is set for drift to take place.
Right. So it's not just about these abstract probabilities.
Yeah.
It's also about the actual physical movement of organisms and how new variations kind of pop up in these isolated groups.
I see. So it's grounded in these real world processes.
Right.
Okay. So we've got Gulick setting the stage with these isolated populations.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to the early 20th century.
Okay.
And we've got this husband and wife team, the Hagedorns.
The Hagedorns, fascinating folks.
They were looking at what seemed like really minor, insignificant traits.
Yeah, like tiny hairs on cereal seeds.
Yeah, like who cares, right?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine natural selection like meticulously shaping those tiny hairs.
Exactly.
Right, so they were arguing that something else must be at play here.
Something else besides selection.
Exactly, something working alongside it.
Okay, so what do they propose?
Well, they highlighted several ways this could happen.
Okay.
One was this idea of a founder effect.
Okay.
So imagine a new population is established by just a small handful of individuals from a larger group.
Yep.
And this small group, they might not be genetically representative of the original population, right?
They're just like a random sample.
Exactly. And that randomness is key.
Okay.
And then they also point to the splitting of a larger population into smaller, isolated subgroups.
Okay, so similar to what Gulick was talking about with the snails.
Right. Very similar. The isolation is crucial.
Okay.
And then they had this concept of what they called random sampling of parents.
Okay.
Which is basically just the simple fact that not every individual in a generation gets to reproduce equally.
Yeah, some get lucky, some don't.
Right. It's a bit of a lottery. And they recognize that in these smaller groups with their limited genetic variation, a particular trait could become uniform much faster. Just by pure chance, even without any real advantage for survival or reproduction.
Just because the right individuals happen to reproduce.
Exactly. So, building on Gulick's focus on isolated populations, the Hagedorns added this crucial element of random sampling within those populations.
Right, so it's like a two-step process.
Exactly. Isolation and then random events within those isolated groups.
And they saw that as a real driver of evolutionary change, even when selection isn't the main player.
And that's a big departure from Gulick's focus primarily on geographic separation.
Yeah, it's a subtle but important distinction.
Exactly.
So we've got this foundation laid by Gulick and the Hagedorns.
Right.
And then enter Sewell Wright in the 1930s.
Ah, Sewell Wright.
Yeah, and he's the one who really gives us one of the first clear, formal definitions of drift, right?
He really formalizes it.
Yeah.
He defines it as this random sampling of genes within a breeding population of limited size.
Okay.
And this random sampling leads to changes in gene frequencies purely by chance.
Just like the Hagedorns we're talking about.
Right. He's taking their ideas and making them more precise.
Okay.
But what's really important about Wright's contribution is that he expands on the Hagedorns' concept of random parent sampling.
Okay, how so?
He explicitly includes the random sampling of gametes as well.
Oh, so the sperm and the eggs.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's not just about which individuals get to reproduce, but also about which sperm fertilizes which egg.
So it's like another layer of randomness?
Exactly. It's like a double dose of chance.
Okay.
And he also makes a really important clarification.
What's that?
That while both drift and inbreeding are more influential in small populations,
Okay.
they're actually distinct processes.
So you can have one without necessarily having the other.
You got it.
That's a good distinction to make.
It is because they often get lumped together.
Right.
But they're not the same thing.
Okay. And then, of course, we have R.A. Fisher.
Oh, yes, the other giant of population genetics.
Yeah. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that even though Wright and Fisher famously disagreed on so many aspects of evolutionary theory,
they had some pretty big arguments.
They did.
But on the fundamental nature of drift, they were largely in agreement.
They were on the same page.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing when you think about all the other things they disagreed on.
Right. And there's even this quote from Fisher and Ford that Wright actually considered an acceptable statement of his own view.
Oh, really? What did they say?
Well, they basically emphasized these chance deviations in gene ratios that happen due to the random sampling of gametes.
So they're both acknowledging this role of chance.
Exactly.
That's pretty significant.
It is, but even though they agreed on the basic idea,
yeah,
the understanding of drift continued to kind of evolve and change over time.
Right. It wasn't static.
Yeah, so later on, Wright started including other things as forms of drift.
Like what kind of things?
Well, things like fluctuations in mutation rates,
okay,
changes in migration patterns, even the influence of selection pressures.
He started lumping all those things into drift.
He did. And as you can imagine, this broader definition caused some pushback.
I can see why.
Yeah, Kane and Curry, these other biologists, they argued that this was getting too messy.
Right, you're kind of losing the clarity of what drift actually is.
Exactly. They said it was blurring the lines between distinct biological mechanisms.
It's like you're calling everything drift.
Yeah, so they advocated for using the term sampling drift to specifically refer to that core concept of random sampling of genes.
Okay, so back to the basics.
Yeah, keep it focused.
And did Wright ever adopt that term?
He actually did later on.
Interesting. So it seems like even from the very beginning, there was this ongoing discussion and some disagreement about the precise boundaries of what constitutes drift.
Exactly. It wasn't like this perfectly clear-cut concept from day one.
And that makes sense, right? Science is messy.
It is. It's an evolving process.
Yeah, and John Beatty, this philosopher of biology, he neatly sums this up by describing drift as a heterogeneous category of evolutionary causes and effects.
So it's not just one thing.
It's a whole collection of things.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about chance sampling of gametes, random selection of parents, founder effects, population splits.
All that stuff we've been discussing.
Exactly. And all of these things have a greater impact in smaller populations.
Right. The smaller the population, the more these random events matter.
Exactly. And they lead to these outcomes like unpredictable shifts in gene frequencies, the loss of genetic diversity, and the fixation of certain traits just by chance.
It's no wonder this has become such a focal point for discussion in the philosophy of biology.
Yeah, it's like a philosophical goldmine.
It really is.
Yeah.
So with all these different ideas about its origins, how do philosophers actually try to define drift?
Right. And maybe even more importantly, how do they distinguish it from natural selection?
Because at first glance, they might seem kind of similar.
Yeah, you could see how they could get confused.
So how do we tease them apart?
Well, one really influential approach that builds directly on this historical context is what's called the causal process account.
Okay, the causal process account.
Yeah, and it goes back to John Beatty again. He argued that the common thread running through all these phenomena we label as drift is a form of random or indiscriminate sampling.
Indiscriminate sampling, okay.
Right, and this indiscriminate sampling, it inevitably leads to what we call sampling error.
Sampling error?
Yeah, in the next generation's gene frequencies.
So can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah.
What do you mean by indiscriminate sampling?
Sure. So Beatty explains that parent sampling...
Okay, so the process of determining which organisms reproduce and how many offspring they have.
Exactly.
Right.
He says that can be either discriminate or indiscriminate.
Okay, so two different flavors.
Yeah, so discriminate parent sampling, that means it's based on the physical differences between individuals.
So the classic idea of natural selection, the fittest survive and reproduce more.
Right, exactly. But then you have indiscriminate parent sampling.
Okay.
And that means it happens without regard to those physical differences.
So it's just random chance who reproduces.
Basically, yeah. And
Right.
he applies a similar logic to gamete sampling.
So which sperm fertilizes which egg? Okay.
And in that case, it might not matter at all what those sperm or eggs look like or what their genetic makeup is.
It's just a random lottery.
Right. So the key point here is whether those heritable traits, those physical differences, actually play a causal role in reproductive success.
So in drift they don't, and in selection they do.
Exactly. You got it.
And Roberta Milstein, building on the work of Beatty and Susan Hodge, she takes this a step further, right?
She does.
She argues that in drift processes, any heritable physical differences between individuals are causally irrelevant to their reproductive success.
Right. Those differences don't matter.
Whereas in natural selection, those differences are precisely what drive the whole process.
They're the key to the whole thing.
And this focus on causal relevance, that's what lets us separate drift from selection conceptually.
Gives us a clear dividing line.
It's about identifying the real causal players in the game.
Exactly.
Now, I remember reading about these examples that are often used to illustrate this idea of indiscriminate sampling.
Oh, yeah, the analogies.
Right, like that thought experiment with the identical twins.
Yeah, one gets struck by lightning.
Exactly, and doesn't reproduce while the other one does.
And the text here seems to suggest that's not a great analogy.
It does. Why is that?
Well, for a couple of reasons.
Right.
Firstly, drift, just like selection, requires heritable variation within a population.
Okay.
So even though the twins might look alike,
Yeah.
are they really genetically identical in every way that matters?
That's a good point.
And more importantly, the lightning strike example, and makes it seem like drift, is this rare catastrophic event.
Like a freak accident.
Yeah, whereas in population genetics, drift is generally understood as this continuous ongoing process.
It's always there lurking in the background.
Exactly. It's happening all the time in every population, not just when lightning strikes.
Okay, so it needs to be a pervasive possibility, not an exception.
Right.
And what about that coin toss analogy?
Oh, yeah, that one's not so great either.
Yeah, the text wasn't a fan of that one either.
It's a bit too simplistic.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, coin tosses, they have a binary outcome, right?
Heads or tails?
Exactly. And that doesn't really capture the complexity of genetic variation.
Right. They're usually way more than two options.
Exactly. And it's not even clear what the population is supposed to be in that analogy.
Well, like, what are the coin flips representing?
Right. It doesn't quite map onto the biological reality we're trying to model.
So if those examples aren't ideal, what's a better way to visualize this whole indiscriminate sampling thing?
Well, the urn analogy, it's a classic, and it's much more helpful, I think.
Okay, the urn analogy.
Yeah, it's adapted from Dogzansky's work on this model by Dubinin and Romashov.
Okay.
So picture this. You've got an urn filled with balls of different colors.
Okay.
Each color represents a different genetic variant.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And you randomly draw a small handful of balls without looking.
Okay, so it's indiscriminate sampling.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, the proportions of colors in your hand,
Yeah.
they might not perfectly match the proportions in the original urn.
Right, just because of chance.
Exactly. And if you repeat this over several generations, the frequencies of those different colored balls in your samples, they'll fluctuate randomly.
Just like gene frequencies can drift in a population.
Precisely. It really nicely illustrates how chance sampling in a finite population can lead to these unpredictable changes in the frequencies of different variants over time.
It gives you a concrete sense of those fluctuating frequencies Darwin talked about.
It does.
Of course, it's still just an analogy.
Sure.
It's not perfect.
No analogy is.
It doesn't perfectly capture biological reproduction.
Right.
But it's still a good way to get your head around the basic idea.
I think so.
Okay, so we've got this causal process account grounded in the idea of indiscriminate sampling.
Right.
But Beatty himself, he raised this tricky point about distinguishing drift from selection.
Oh, yeah.
When you have these really improbable outcomes of natural selection.
Yeah, like what if the less fit individuals somehow manage to out-reproduce the more fit ones?
Just by sheer luck.
Just by chance.
How do we make sense of that?
Right. It's a good question, and Milstein addresses this directly.
She does.
She argues that we need to keep this clear distinction between the process of drift and its outcomes.
Okay.
And the same goes for selection.
So process versus outcome.
Exactly. So even if you get this weird, improbable result where the less adapted individuals happen to have more offspring, the process that led to that result was still discriminate sampling based on heritable physical differences.
So selection was still operating. It's just that chance threw a wrench in the works.
Exactly. The outcome was unexpected, but the underlying process was still selection.
Okay, I see.
And on the flip side, drift is defined by a process where those heritable physical differences are causally irrelevant.
They don't matter.
They don't matter.
Okay.
And that's how we can keep these two processes conceptually distinct.
Even if their outcomes might sometimes look similar.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about the causal pathway, not just the end result.
So it's all about tracing back the chain of events and seeing what factors were actually in play. So according to this causal process view, what are the specific real-world things that actually count as genetic drift?
Well, they're the mechanisms we've already been talking about.
Okay.
Random sampling of gametes during fertilization.
Which sperm wins the race?
Right. Random sampling of parents who get to reproduce.
Maybe some survive a storm by chance and others don't.
Exactly. The founding of new populations by a small group.
The founder effect.
The founder effect and the splitting of an existing population into smaller, isolated groups.
So those are the processes that we classify as drift.
Exactly. And as we've discussed all of these processes, their effects are much more pronounced in smaller populations.
Right. The smaller the population, the bigger the impact of chance.
Exactly. And it seems like other philosophers like Grant Stevens, Duncan Northcott, and Tobias Halfay, they also generally agree with this sampling process view.
Okay. So there's some consensus there.
Yeah, it seems to be the dominant view.
But I'm guessing there are other ways to think about drift as well.
Of course, there always are.
Philosophers love to debate these things.
They do.
So what are some of the alternative perspectives?
Well, one interesting challenge comes from Robert Brandon.
Okay, what does he say?
He argues that the causal process account, it might not fully capture how biologists actually distinguish between drift and selection when they're doing their research.
Interesting. So there's a disconnect between theory and practice.
Yeah, potentially. So Brandon, he sees both drift and selection as fundamentally arising from the same underlying process, which is sampling.
Okay.
But he defines drift as any deviation from the expected reproductive success that happens due to this inherent sampling error.
Okay, so it's all about how the actual outcomes differ from what we would predict based on fitness.
Exactly. And selection, on the other hand, that's differential reproduction that aligns with those expected differences.
Okay, so for Brandon, the definition of drift, it inherently includes both the process of sampling and its statistical outcome.
Right. It's both process and outcome.
Interesting. And how does Milstein respond to that?
Well, she defends her process-based view, arguing that it's more conceptually clear.
Okay.
And that it allows us to differentiate between different biological phenomena that might lead to the same statistical result.
So two different paths can lead to the same destination.
Exactly. And she acknowledges that Brendan has a point that many biologists do incorporate both process and outcome into their working definitions of drift.
So there's a bit of a mix in practice.
Yeah, it's not always so neat and tidy.
But that's why philosophical analysis is so valuable here, right?
Absolutely. It helps us clarify these concepts and figure out what we really mean when we use these terms.
Yeah, it's about getting to the heart of the matter.
Right.
Okay, so beyond this debate between process and outcome, are there any other philosophical views that offer alternative ways to distinguish drift from selection?
Yeah, definitely. So Jessica Pfeiffer, she has this interesting perspective.
What's that?
She proposes that the probabilities we assign in our models of natural selection, they often involve ignoring a whole bunch of minor environmental and internal factors.
We can't account for everything.
Right. It's just too complex, so we have to simplify.
Okay.
And Pfeiffer suggests that drift can be seen as being caused by the actual specific distribution of these ignored factors.
But the things we leave out of the model.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And this helps maintain a causal distinction from selection, which focuses on the major fitness-relevant factors that we do explicitly include in our models.
So drift is driven by the stuff we don't measure.
In a way.
And then there's Peter Gildenhuys.
Oh, yes. Gildenhuys. He offers this concept of NINPX.
NNPX. Okay. I'm going to need you to unpack that one.
Sure, no problem.
Oh.
So NINPXC stands for non-interactive, non-pervasive, and indiscriminate causal influences.
Okay. That's a mouthful.
It is, but the idea is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
He's saying that drift is characterized by these causal influences that are random and don't have a consistent effect across a population.
Okay, so they're indiscriminate.
They are, and his view, it gets a bit nuanced when it comes to whether drift can co-occur with selection.
Yeah, we've touched on that before. It's a tricky point.
It is, and he also talks about the role of irrelevant causal factors.
Like what?
Like geographic location,
Okay.
which in his view shouldn't be considered part of drift because they're not directly related to reproduction.
But even with all these nuances,
Yeah.
he generally agrees that in practice, his account and the causal process account, they would likely identify the same things as examples of drift.
Yeah.
So they're both pointing to the same set of phenomena.
For the most part, yeah.
Okay, so it seems like this idea of indiscriminate,
Yeah.
it's kind of a core theme here.
It really is.
The key differentiator.
Exactly.
But then we have philosophers like Shapiro and Sober, who initially supported this distinct processes view,
Right.
only for Sober to kind of back off later.
He changed his mind.
He did what was going on there.
Well, their initial support for this view, it seems to have stemmed from this concern that if selection and drift are defined as completely separate processes,
Yeah.
it might logically mean that they can't happen at the same time on the same population or even the same trait.
Like they're mutually exclusive.
Right, and that just doesn't seem to match up with reality.
Because we see examples where both drift and selection are clearly at work.
We do like Lamott's work on those snails.
This is Cepeda de Morales.
Yeah, where you've got camouflage, which is a selective pressure,
Right.
and founder effects, which are a form of drift,
Yeah.
both acting on shell color and banding patterns.
So they're both influencing the same traits.
Exactly, and that shows that these processes can happen concurrently,
Okay.
and the causal process account, it actually addresses this concern directly.
How so?
Well, it clarifies that since drift requires heritable genetic variation,
Okay.
non-heritable fact, like the exact geographic location of an individual,
Yeah.
they're not directly relevant to the distinction between drift and selection.
Because they don't affect which genes get passed on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, while small population size is historically associated with drift and makes its effects stronger,
Yeah.
it's not the defining characteristic of drift as a process.
It's not the be-all and end-all.
It's not.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good overview of these biologically inspired, process-oriented views of drift.
Right. Those are the main ones.
But you mentioned earlier that there are also these mathematical approaches.
Oh, yes.
How do those differ in how they define and distinguish drift?
That's a great question, and it represents a pretty significant shift in perspective.
Okay, tell me more.
So a good example of this mathematical approach is the work of Walsh-Lewins and Ariu.
Okay.
They take a very different tack. They identify 4 historical types of drift.
Okay.
Sewell writes original concept, the Hagedorn effect, indiscriminate sampling, and the consequences of finite population sizes when you apply the Hardy-Weinberg law.
Okay, so a mix of processes and outcomes.
Right, and they argue that what unites all of these,
The common thread.
yeah, is a statistical divergence from the predictions we would make if fitness were the only factor.
So they're not looking at the biological mechanism so much?
Not as much.
They're looking at the statistical patterns.
Exactly, and they argue that this divergence from fitness expectations, it's a consequence of having a finite population size.
So the smaller the population, the more likely you are to see these deviations.
Right, and this is a fundamentally outcome-oriented definition of drift.
Oh, wait, outcome-oriented.
Yeah, so the specific biological process that leads to the deviation, that's not their primary focus.
They're more interested in the deviation itself.
Right, they're looking at the statistical signature of drift.
And other philosophers like Pigliucci and Kaplan and Stravens,
Yeah.
they offer similar perspectives, right?
They also focus on these statistical deviations from what we would expect based solely on fitness.
So it's less about the how and more about the what.
Exactly.
Less about the underlying mechanisms and more about the observed statistical patterns.
You got it.
Okay, so for this mathematical view, drift is essentially the failure of the Hardy-Weinberg law to perfectly predict gene frequencies in real finite populations.
That's a good way to put it.
So the Hardy-Weinberg law, it provides this baseline expectation for stable gene frequencies.
Right in the absence of any evolutionary forces.
It's like the null hypothesis.
Yeah, a kind of theoretical ideal.
And when we see deviations from these expected frequencies,
Yeah.
that's what they often label as drift.
And the smaller the population,
Yeah.
the more room there is for random sampling error.
Right.
So the bigger the drift effect.
It's like the population size is a magnifying glass for drift.
Exactly.
But the text here, it's critical of this purely mathematical, outcome-oriented approach.
Yeah, it raises some valid concerns.
What are the main objections?
Well, the main worry is that this approach might miss the forest for the trees. It might overlook the actual biological phenomena being modeled.
So we're so focused on the numbers that we forget about the real organisms.
Right, and maybe even more importantly, it might overlook the reasons why we're interested in the evolutionary dynamics of finite populations in the first place.
So what are those reasons?
Well, finite populations, they behave differently than infinite ones.
Okay.
And that has real consequences for how evolution plays out.
It affects things like the loss of genetic diversity.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the spread of beneficial or harmful mutations.
So it's not just an abstract mathematical curiosity.
It's not. It has real biological significance.
And Milstein, Skipper, and Dietrich, they argue that focusing solely on the mathematical model and its statistical outputs, it risks conflating the model itself with the complex biological reality it's meant to represent.
Right. It's like mistaking the map for the territory.
Exactly. And they suggest that this perspective might be more focused on how we measure deviations from theoretical expectations, rather than understanding the underlying biological causes of those deviations.
That's a subtle but important distinction.
It is, because it's not enough to just say, oh, look, there's a deviation from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, therefore it must be drift.
Right. We need to understand why that deviation is happening.
What are the actual biological processes at play?
Exactly.
Okay, so if we don't take the Hardy-Weinberg model purely as this abstract mathematical expectation, is there another way to see its connection to drift as a real biological process?
I think there is one way to bridge this gap, is to interpret the Hardy-Weinberg model, even in a finite population context, as implicitly representing the sampling of one generation to produce the next.
Okay, so the parental generation is like the population being sampled.
Right, and the offspring generation represents the sample that's drawn from that population.
Okay, I see.
And because of the inherent randomness in who reproduces and which gametes combine, this sample, the next generation's gene frequencies, it might not perfectly mirror the gene frequencies of the parental generation.
And that deviation is a direct consequence of those random sampling processes we talked about.
Precisely, it's drift in action.
Okay, so the Hardy-Weinberg model, even though it's an idealized mathematical construct,
Yeah.
it can still help us.